Hey, welcome back. Oh man, are you a poet and you know it? Well, this is the place to be because we have a poet for you today. One of the best. Got a book, got a lot to talk about. His past, his present, his future. My name's Vin DeQuino. His name is Terry Hummel. Terry, welcome, buddy.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. You have quite an interesting background that kind of led up to where you are today as a poet. So tell me a little bit about who Terry Hummel really is.
Well, that would be telling. But it might be of interest to the viewers to know that my background is not exactly typical of poets. I come from a farm in rural Mississippi,
Wow.
a very remote part of the state, where my family had been there for a couple of generations, very much a farm family, and there was no particular focus anywhere in the family on the arts or on reading books, for that matter.
Yeah. Too many chores to do.
Well, sure, and a general lack of interest anyway, not just among my family, but in the whole local culture at large.
And yet, ironically, some of the greatest poems of all times are about farm life and farmland and the peace of the country.
That's true, and also ironically, maybe some of the greatest writers in the country come from Mississippi. But it's hard to know exactly why that's true. Most of them are not poets, however. Most of them are novelists like Faulkner. And Eudora Welty and so on. But for me, poetry was kind of a way out, honestly, because I realized at some point that I was in some conflict with the local culture, as you might say. Because it was, I was born there in 1950. My teen years coincided precisely with the 60s. It was a civil rights movement time. And the county in which I grew up was 70% African American, about.
Wow.
But African Americans in those days did not vote.
Yeah.
They did not hold any public offices. They had no power. They had no money. None of us had any money, but what money there was in the hands of the white minority. And at some point, I began to feel a certain, should we say, disaffection for that particular way of things.
Yeah.
But it's not easy to find your way out when you're in your early teens. So.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of our greatest thoughts are in hindsight.
Yeah, well, that's true, or clearest ones. I mean, the thing about a racist situation like that, which is basically what it was, is that if you think a single clear thought, the whole structure falls apart because it is so irrational. But one's parents are invested in that, and therefore they don't want you to think that clear thought, because if you do, you will become the enemy.
Yeah.
And which in those days was a big deal.
Yep.
1964, 1965.
Yeah, those were hard times.
Well, it was a war zone, frankly. Mississippi in those days was it was like a slow war.
Wow.
I grew up 40 miles away from Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers were killed, infamously. It might as well have happened in my backyard. It could have. There were people around that part of the world who were just like the people in that part of the world. I mean, it was the same world.
Yeah.
And so, it was in fact a kind of war zone. And there were lines drawn, though people didn't talk about it much. It was all very under the surface.
You really couldn't talk about it much. It wasn't something that you addressed publicly because it was pushed under the covers.
Yeah, well, it was addressed publicly in certain ways. Even in my high school, sometimes public speakers would come. We would be brought to an assembly, and the speaker would be a John Birch Society guy.
Oh, wow.
That used to happen. It wouldn't be legal now.
Yeah.
But then nobody really thought about it.
No.
And so that happened. As I say, there was a long period for me of figuring out what my route was going to be. And part of it came to have to do with books in the first place. Not so much poetry in the beginning, but the idea that one might be a writer, that I might be a writer, was an important thing for me. The other thing that was important for me was music, which came very powerfully to the house, so to speak, in a lot of ways. And music was the first art that I aspired to. It taught me music, taught me how to be an artist.
Are you a musician?
Yes,
Oh,
I am.
what do you play?
I'm a saxophonist.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of odd too,
Jazz.
because this, well, yeah, but when I gravitated to the saxophone, I have no idea. I was 9 years old. They took me into a big room full of instruments. You know, the band director was
Pick one. Oh, that one was
yeah,
great.
well, that was it. The band director was probably getting a kickback from the music company. They were all the instruments were there. You know, clarinets and trumpets and trombones and drums and so on. You'd think that a 9-year-old kid would go straight to the drums. That
Yeah,
makes sense
yeah.
to me. But I went straight to. There was an alto saxophone, a Conn alto saxophone in a case. I walked straight over to it and said to my mother, I would like to try that.
Wow.
And why, I don't know.
Wow.
I don't even think I knew what it was supposed to sound like at that point. If I'd ever heard anybody
And
play
did
a
you stay with
saxophone.
it for a
Yes,
while?
yeah, I
Yeah.
still play it.
Wow.
Yep,
Wow.
sure do. And it's taken
Yeah,
me a few
oh,
places.
man.
I had a kind of semi-professional career.
Good sax player is worth his salt.
Well, yeah, if one were a good one, that would be a thing. But it was a route for me away.
Yeah.
And I needed that because I was not going to find it otherwise. You know, without poetry, without books, without music, I might still be there. And while that wouldn't be a disaster, maybe, I would certainly be a very different person.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. I left my little small town. It's actually a small city. I was born and raised in Utica, New York.
Uh-huh.
And there came a time when it was obvious I needed to move on. And I did. I came to school this way and never went back.
Yep.
You know, and in a lot of ways it was good, and in a lot of ways maybe it isn't. But you're right, I would have been a totally different person too. In terms of writing, when I was in college, I discovered the most amazing kind of literature I've ever seen, black literature. And I met Baldwin and Richard Wright, and I said, wow, people can write about that? You know, and it was like life. You know, a rat that gets into a baby's crib, a boy who accidentally suffocates a white girl, and his whole life is destroyed. And I mean, just topics that, you know, in school it was, I hate to say, white literature. You know?
Of course, yeah.
So
especially in those days.
yeah, especially in those days. So when I discovered that you can do those things, and then later discovered Judy Blume, and found out that you could even do that when you write about teenagers and kids, and you could write about what real life is, it was just amazing. So what was your awakening? What turned you into poetry?
Well, I mean, in practical terms, poetry per se, it was taking a workshop at a university. I went. The first university I went to was Mississippi State because it was the nearby university. My generation in my family was the first generation that went to university and finished.
Yeah.
My father had gone to university, but he was interrupted by the war. And when the war was over, he just came back to the farm and got married and began having children and, you know, working for a living. But they were determined that we would all go to college, which we all did. And when I say we all, I mean my brother and myself, but also my cousins who all lived on the farm as well. There were 8 of us, and we all went to college. And everyone finished except one, and he came back to the farm, but everyone else went away. Wow. Anyway, I went into a writing workshop because I thought I wanted to write stories, prose. And that particular workshop was kind of loosely organized, so everybody was just writing whatever they felt like.
Yeah.
And some people were writing poems and some people were writing stories. And I was writing stories that weren't getting very good feedback, so then I thought, well, maybe I'll try one of these poem things. You know? So I tried that and I got better feedback on that. And after a few months, I began to realize this was a thing that I did better than the other thing.
One of the things, you know, I work with writers all the time. I've worked with writers all my life, young writers, old writers, in between writers, and that's one of the things, one of the messages that couldn't be clearer to me. You have to find your writing self. There's a part of you that just needs a vehicle to say the things you feel. And unfortunately in school, we don't get the opportunity to really experiment with poetry and novel writing in short story writing. We get little samples and little tastes. We meet some of the greatest of our time. But to actually sit and zone in on who you are and how you can say it best is very difficult. And you won't know unless you try. You have got to stick your neck out or your pen out.
Yeah, that's true. Although in my case, it was a little more complicated or different from that, insofar as when I looked at that self to which you allude, I found somebody I didn't like.
Oh.
Because I had been conditioned in that racist environment.
Yeah.
You know, racism, that kind of racism, institutionalized racism like we had in Mississippi, I would say any kind of racism really, but that particular kind is a conditioning of a self. You create a self based on the presumptive and illusory superiority to somebody else, right?
Yep.
So I am who I am because I'm superior to you.
Yeah.
Now, that was something I had to dismantle. So it was, for me, it was not so much a question of finding my writer self, it was a question of finding my alternative self, maybe my true self, I don't know. I mean, is there an essential true self? I don't know, that's a question we can't answer here. But I had to find a different one than the one I was dealing with at that
Sometimes
point.
unlearning is the most important part of learning.
Yes, absolutely. Now, one of my teachers in high school did a very important thing for me. I don't know how the others in the class felt about it, but when I was in the 11th grade, in those days the 11th grade was the year that you studied American literature in high school.
Yep.
So the teacher, who was sort of the youngest teacher in the school, I think, Mr. Gaither, came in. He was not yet 30, so to us he was kind of in fact, I remember when he turned 30, we all felt betrayed by Mr. Gaither. Now we couldn't trust him anymore. Remember that? Don't trust anyone under 30, over 30. But he came in one day to class and he said, listen, he said, I'm going to give you something to read, but he said you have to, it's copied, mimeograph. Remember mimeograph?
Yeah. I think I still have the blue on the side of my
probably.
hand.
Well, I inhaled a lot of mimeograph fumes in my youth, which I think probably is an explanation for why I am the way I am. But anyway, he came in with this little handout. It was like 2 pages. And he said, I'm going to give you this to read, but you must bring it back to me tomorrow. You must. You are required absolutely to bring it back. And he said, you can't tell anyone that I gave you this to read. It must be a secret. It must be. Well, I don't know how the others in the class felt, but to me this was like heaven. Give me something that's forbidden. So he handed this out. And it turned out to be a little short story, which was Ernest Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place.
Wow.
Which, if you know that story, it's about a man who commits suicide. It's about an American expatriate in Spain who goes every night to a little bar. And the story is actually told from the point of view of a waiter who works in that bar, and who they pile up the brandy cups, and that's how they calculate the bill. So every night this guy's got a huge pile of brandy cups because he's a really bad alcoholic. He comes in and drinks a lot of brandy, and then he goes home. And then one night he doesn't come in. And that's the night that the story is set on. And it turns out he's killed himself. And the waiter has this little meditation at the end of the story in which he says a version of the Lord's Prayer that goes, Our nada who art in nada, nada be thy name. And so, and the word nada, of course, is the Spanish word for nothing.
Yeah.
And so it's his little existential Lord's Prayer. That's the reason why the teacher didn't want us to tell anybody that we had read this story, right?
Yeah.
This would be very, very bad juju in that school.
Yeah.
But I really think that it was a pedagogical ploy anyway to get our attention.
Yeah. Oh,
which,
yeah.
boy, it
Absolutely.
did. You know.
All you have to do is say, "Don't do this."
I know, and see, that's
Guaranteed the class will do it.
I've often said that the best way to teach poetry in high school would be to tell students that they must not read poetry.
Yeah.
Don't try to force them to read it.
Oh, yeah.
Tell them, forbid them from it. In fact, tell
Yeah.
them that if they read it, they'll fail the class. If they read it, they'll be thrown out of school. If they read it, they'll be sent to jail. This will create a great desire among the young people for poetry. Of course, that's not a serious suggestion, but you know what I mean. That's what it was like, and it was this moment when I thought, this thing that he has given us here this thing is alive. This is dangerous.
Yep.
And it wasn't poetry, but you know, Hemingway's short stories, some of them, it was like a page and a half long.
So Terry,
beautiful.
when did your first poem when did you give birth to your first poem?
Oh, I couldn't tell you that. I have no idea. I mean, I wrote poetry when I was in high school, but it wasn't very serious about it, nor is it any good. But I did do it. The same teacher actually handed me a book of E. Cummings poems one day.
Oh my!
And he just said, "I can't make any sense." He called me aside and he said, "Here, take this book and read it. I can't make any sense out of this. Maybe you can." So I went and read that, and this was like, oh, this is not Edgar Allan Poe anymore. This is something else.
The thing that impressed me most about E. Cummings is when the teacher said, "I'm going to give you some poems by a man who won't follow the rules," and he makes up his own rules. I was like, I'm in.
Yeah, well, that was true. He was the first poet, true poet of the typewriter also. I mean, without
wouldn't
the
use
typewriter.
capital letters. I said, well,
Scattered his
but
poems all
that's
over
the
the
rule.
page. Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
Right. Anyway, that was important too because it showed me that poetry didn't have to be what I thought it was.
Yeah.
It could be something else. But still, I wasn't taking it seriously until a little later when I was in college, when I was first in college. And then it began to seem suddenly that because nobody in the place where I had grown up paid any attention to poetry at all. It was not that they didn't like it. It was that it was not even on the radar anywhere. It was just not, it didn't exist, Literature in general really didn't exist that much. I remember hearing my father mumble something about Faulkner, that traitor to the South, one day. Seriously. Faulkner had relatively enlightened racial views, and wrote about it very, very well. So to some people, I don't know that my father had ever read a word of Faulkner, but he had somehow absorbed this idea about Faulkner. Anyway, my point though is that they were not readers. So poetry seemed like a place that I could go, so to speak, not only as a reader but as a writer, to become a different person. I would be a different person when I wrote poetry. I would be not that person from that place. Of course, the fact is that poetry has a way of taking you back to your beginnings. It won't let you, if you stay with it long enough and you're serious enough about it, it will not let you go. It will make you re-examine everything. And so eventually, over a decade or so, I had to reprocess, so to speak, my whole life through that lens. And this is how ultimately I arrived at something like a grown-up persona, you might say.
So your poems today, what are they about?
Well, about is one of those hard words, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you say of a book of poems that it is about anything in particular, you're probably not telling the truth because there are a lot of poems in there and each one is about something that may be different from all the others. I do tend to write, though, fairly unified books. And in fact, this book, which just came out this year, Eon, which I'm pointing over at the camera just in case they want to focus on it so that people can know about it. This book, Eon, is the third in a trilogy of books of poetry, which came out from LSU Press. This one just came out early this year, but the other two came out earlier on, and this is the third one. So that there's a very long view of something. But to try to summarize quickly what I'm doing as a poet, rather than a subject, I have to really kind of define a philosophy, you might say. It derives from Whitman. And I realized at some point, reading Whitman very carefully over a long period of time, that Whitman is writing about the body politic. He's writing about the nation as if it were a person. The I in Whitman's Song of Myself is not Whitman himself, it is America. Now, sometimes it's the individual American, and sometimes it's the whole body, so to speak.
Yep.
But it's always part of that body. So the question becomes
belief.
Exactly. So the question becomes, how does an individual cell in a body speak to the entire body? Or how does the body itself as a whole communicate with the individual cell? On what level does it do that?
And what happens when you don't agree with the voice of the body?
Well,
and that's where some great poets
or
are
does
born.
that or does that even matter? I mean, what if a cell in your toenail doesn't agree with what your brain is thinking?
You get an infection and you have to cut it off.
Maybe so. I don't know. It's a weird question when you start thinking of it that way. But Whitman was doing that. Whitman was trying, really I think mostly what he was up to was channeling the thoughts of the body politic, the entire body, through his poems.
Yep.
And that created a kind of voice that had never been seen nor heard before anywhere.
He was giving us a perspective that we never even knew existed.
Exactly, and which we still don't know exists. Because I
It's
mean,
true.
this thing I'm talking about is not the way we generally think about ourselves, and yet we all participate in this. The body politic, ultimately, what is it? I mean, is it in fact an objective thing? Is it a fiction that we all create together? Which I would say it probably is, but a fiction that we create all together is in some sense objective too. And so there's a whole passel of problems in this. But to come back around to your other observation about agreement and disagreement, you know, Whitman was trying to make that body create itself. He wanted it to be a certain way. He wanted it to be this exalted thing. Now I think we probably don't share that optimism. It's a harder vision to bear forward in our time than it was in Whitman's time. Too much ugly water, so to speak, has passed under the bridge. And we look back at the last 150 years of American history, and we have to go, well, you know, we have a lot of issues here. Not to mention the last 2 weeks of American history. You know? So
I hear it.
So there we have an issue. And so if one is writing in that place, in that kind of Whitmanic place now, the voice is different.
Is there any such thing as a signature poem for Terry Hummer's voice?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll read you a poem
There you go.
that is called My Voice. How about that?
Ah,
Which might get you into the territory. Now, I should mention, there's an odd word in here, which, depending on your relation to things musical and or to things biblical, you may or may not recognize the word sackbut. Do you know what a sackbut is?
no.
Well, a sackbut's a musical instrument. There are sackbuts in the Bible. In the Old Testament, people are playing the dulcimer and the sackbut a couple of times, here, there, and yonder. There are also sackbuts in medieval music, and up until contemporary times, they're still around.
Is it similar to a modern day instrument?
Well, yeah, the sackbut that we think of now is a it comes from medieval times, and it is a small version of a trombone.
Oh, okay.
So it's like a little trombone, kind of like a pocket trumpet. No. There's something called a slide trumpet that's similar, but it's not the same.
Okay.
Now, in the Bible, well, the poem actually explains this.
All right.
So let me just do the poem.
Go for it.
My Voice. It is an instrument not unlike the sackbut. Odd, but less ancient than is generally thought, useful for hailing cabs and torturing cats. And although the sackbut is biblical, we are not talking about the biblical sackbut, since that instrument was a Syrian lute. Now, this is the problem. You see, in the Bible, when they say sackbut, it's a stringed instrument. But when I was a kid, I didn't know that, so I had this kind of weird, confused idea about the instruments in the Bible. That instrument was a Syrian lute, and this is a small trombone. Not tiny enough to fit in my pocket, but not so enormous that I can't easily haul it along to a picnic or to an Indian restaurant where it is regarded as an unclean thing. Its metal is bright, but not precious. Reflective, so that when I look at it, I see a warped version of my own face, as in a saddle mirror. Mornings, I take it out of its case and run through my repertoire of scales, exercises, and etudes. It reminds me it is an avatar of the Logos, but it is not biblical because it does not summon the people to worship any graven image. I work tenderly with it to master a riff of Jack Teagarden's, who's a great jazz trombonist. Not at all the kind of thing that brought down Jericho. Those were trumpets, if memory serves, and if memory doesn't serve, what the hell good is it? My voice is the voice of memory. I will someday forget it and leave it in the back of a Manhattan cab, perhaps, or more majestically at a pawn shop in New Orleans, where some small child might see it and wonder at it and beg for it until her father buys it for her. And in its seductive shimmer, she will burn as I once did and learn what not to see.
Whoa.
So the
Pretty
voice,
powerful.
the voice is like an instrument, but what instrument exactly? And in the end, that image in the end of the pawn shop alludes to the old practice, and probably still the current practice, of musicians not having enough money and taking their instruments down to the pawn shop.
I noticed this poem doesn't rhyme. Is that characteristic of your poetry?
It is. Well, that's a complicated question. The majority of my poems anymore are not traditionally formal, though I still do write from time to time in form. I was educated as a formalist when I was in school, in college in the beginning, because I was in a conservative place where all my teachers were old-fashioned, and actually I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But I was schooled in the writing of meter and in fixed forms, particularly the sonnet, which I became very good at, and I've written a lot of sonnets in my time. But therefore, I shouldn't say but, I should say therefore, I have available to me both traditions, so to speak. The tradition of free verse, which is by now a tradition, by the way. It's been around long enough, and it has formal.
It's certainly accepted.
Yeah, and it has formal concerns as well. But I can also write when the mood strikes, or when the theme demands, a formal poem as well.
Well, guess what? I have bad news for you.
What's that?
We have about a minute and a half.
Oh.
Time goes by when you're having fun.
It does, and you're lots of fun.
Well, thank you. Any final words?
Well, yes, support your local poet, which is him, I think.
Yeah.
And just remember that poetry is not necessary. It's not good for you, and you probably shouldn't read it. In fact, if you do read it, you'll be sent to prison immediately. This will create lots of demand.
Do that. That's
in the population.
Reverse psychology. I like that. Ladies and gentlemen, poetry is the highway to your soul. Go there. Find out what's inside. Who are you? What are you? What makes you tick? Do you believe all of the things you've learned all your years? Or is it time to learn something new? Or, as Terry says, maybe it's time to unlearn some of the things you've learned. In any case, can't thank you enough for bringing your talents to us,
Thank you
for
for
talking to us about the poetry. We do need quickly to hold up these books to make sure you see these covers. So if we can, very quickly before we run out of time, can we get a quick look at these covers? There we go. After the Afterlife. Excellent. And let's hold up the other.
Eon.
And there we are with Eon. Thank you for joining us. Read these books. Find yourself through poetry. Thank you for being here.